You are nothing but a burden on this pack." The words sliced through Lyra like claws through flesh, each syllable designed to remind her of her place at the very bottom of the hierarchy. She felt them settle into the familiar ache in her chest, right beside all the other cruel truths that had been carved into her heart over the years. Elder Marcus stood over her in the pre-dawn darkness, his massive frame blocking out the stars as she knelt in the dirt outside the servant quarters, her hands still raw from scrubbing the pack house floors until midnight. That had always been enough. The endless labour, the silent endurance, the practised invisibility that kept her alive in a world that had decided she was worthless. But tonight something fierce and desperate clawed at her ribs from the inside, and her wolf paced restlessly beneath her skin like a caged thing that had finally grown too large for its prison. "I have to prove I belong here," she thought, watching Elder Marcus's retreating form disappear into the compound. The moonrise hunt was only days away when the pack's strongest wolves would venture into the deep forest to claim territory and bring back proof of their worth. She had never been permitted to join, never even been considered worthy of the attempt. But maybe, if she could bring back something valuable, something that proved her loyalty to the pack's borders, maybe they would finally see her as more than just a mistake that had somehow survived. The forest called to her with a voice older than memory, and for once in her life, Lyra decided to answer. She slipped through the shadows like smoke, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth as she crossed the training grounds and ducked under the perimeter fence. Her wolf surged forward eagerly, desperate to run, to hunt, to feel the wild freedom that had been denied to them both for so long. The moon hung low and silver in the sky, casting everything in stark relief as she padded deeper into the territory that stretched beyond the pack's protective boundaries. These were dangerous lands. Rogue wolves roamed here, exiles and criminals who had been cast out from their own packs, and worse things that had never belonged to any pack at all. The elders had made sure every pack member knew the risks, which was exactly why bringing back proof from these depths would mean something, would prove that she was more than the weak, worthless thing they all believed her to be. The scent hit her first, strange and sour, like decay mixed with wild fury, and her wolf froze mid-stride with every instinct screaming danger. But beneath the alarm, something else stirred. Recognition. Not of the individual scents, but of the threat they represented to her pack's territory. These rogues had crossed the boundary lines. They were hunting in lands that belonged to her people, and even if her people had never wanted her, she would not let them be threatened. Her shift came without conscious thought, bones cracking and reforming with practised efficiency as silver-grey fur sprouted along her limbs. She had always been smaller than the other wolves, more delicate, but what she lacked in size she made up for in speed and determination. The rogues were ahead, 3 of them moving in formation toward the inner territories where the pack's children slept in their beds. She attacked from above, dropping from a rocky outcrop with claws extended and fangs bared. The first rogue went down in a tangle of limbs and surprised yelps, but the other 2 were on her before she could press her advantage. These were not pampered pack wolves who fought for sport and honour. These were desperate, starving creatures who fought to survive, and they had nothing left to lose. Pain exploded along her left flank as claws raked through fur and flesh, and she felt her own blood spatter the forest floor. But even as agony blazed through her ribs, she twisted and snapped, her jaws closing around the throat of the second attacker. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth as she held on, refusing to let go even when the third rogue slammed into her from the side. They rolled across the rocky ground in a blur of fur and fury, and she felt something give way in her shoulder as she hit a fallen log. But her teeth found purchase again, this time in the rogue's leg, and she bit down until she heard bone crack. The creature howled and stumbled backward, and in that moment of victory, something impossible happened. The the rogues stopped fighting. They lifted their heads and breathed deeply, their expressions shifting from rage to confusion. One of them whined low in his throat, a sound of submission that made no sense given that she was bleeding and outnumbered. They circled her slowly, scenting the air around her with growing bewilderment, and she saw something that looked almost like fear creep into their yellow eyes. Then they were gone, melting back into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared, leaving her alone and bleeding in the dark forest with questions she could not begin to answer. The pack hunters found her 3 hours later. She was limping through the undergrowth, her wolf form barely able to maintain the shift as blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. Elder Marcus led the group, his enormous black wolf form radiating authority and barely contained fury as he took in the scene. Her wounds, the scent of rogue wolves still clinging to her fur, the fact that she was miles beyond the safety of pack territory when she should have been sleeping in the servants' quarters. The shift back to human form left her naked and shivering in the pre-dawn cold, her injuries looking even worse against her pale skin. Deep claw marks ran along her ribs, and her left shoulder hung at an unnatural angle that suggested dislocation or worse. But it was the expression on Elder Marcus's face that hurt the most. Not concern for her wounds, not relief that she had survived, but disgust that she had dared to venture where she did not belong. "You reckless, worthless girl," he snarled, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Do you have any idea what you have done? You could have led those rogues straight back to our territory. You could have gotten pack members killed with your selfish need to play at being a warrior." She tried to explain about the boundary crossing, about the rogues heading toward the inner territories, but her words were lost in the wave of condemnation that crashed over her from every direction. The other hunters circled her like she was the enemy, their eyes hard with judgment and disappointment. To them, she was not a pack member who had defended their borders. She was a servant who had forgotten her place, a burden who had nearly caused a catastrophe through her own stupidity. They dragged her back to the compound as the sun rose, her blood leaving a trail in the dust behind them. The entire pack had gathered in the central courtyard by the time they arrived, drawn by the commotion and the scent of blood and shame that clung to her like a second skin. She felt their stares like physical weight, crushing down on her as Elder Marcus recounted her crimes to the assembled crowd. Unauthorized hunting, reckless endangerment, deliberate disobedience of direct orders. Each accusation landed like a blow, and she saw the expressions around her shift from curiosity to disgust to something that looked almost like hatred. These were her people, the only family she had ever known, and they looked at her like she was something diseased that needed to be removed before it could spread. But even as shame burned in her chest and tears tracked through the dirt on her cheeks, her wolf remained strangely calm. Deep inside her mind, she felt it watching the crowd with eyes that held no submission, no fear, only a quiet kind of knowing that she could not understand. It was as if her wolf was waiting for something, listening for a sound that had not yet come. The pack healer refused to treat her wounds, declaring that she would have to heal naturally as punishment for her reckless actions. They threw her into a storage room behind the kitchens, bare stone walls that would serve as her prison, while the pack elders decided her fate. The door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid, and she was alone with her pain and the strange memory of rogue wolves who had fled from her scent like she was something they feared instead of something they could easily destroy. Outside, she could hear the pack returning to their daily routines, their voices carrying through the thin walls as they discussed her punishment and speculated about her future. Some wanted exile, others thought a public lashing would be sufficient. A few suggested that death might be the kindest option, given how clearly unsuited she was to pack life. But her wolf just curled up in the corner of her mind and settled down to wait, like it knew something she did not, like it was listening for footsteps that had not yet arrived, waiting for a presence that would change everything. And in the distance, carried on the morning wind, She thought she heard the sound of howls that did not belong to her pack. Deep, powerful voices that sang of authority and ancient power, growing closer with each passing hour. The Alpha King was coming. The silver crown materialized from starlight and ancient magic the moment her blade found Marcus Ironwood's heart. Lyra felt it settle onto her brow with the weight of destiny fulfilled, a circlet of power that blazed with the accumulated authority of every Silver Queen who had ruled before her. The royal magic that had been building since her awakening now reached its full potential, transforming her from a newly awakened heir into something that commanded the absolute loyalty of every wolf within 100 miles. Marcus Ironwood fell to his knees before her, Celeste's supposedly invincible champion reduced to whimpering submission by the sheer force of royal presence that radiated from her transformed figure. His wolf, which had seemed so menacing minutes earlier, now pressed itself flat against the arena floor in desperate acknowledgement of the true apex predator that stood before them all. The second champion lasted 30 seconds. Elena Swiftrunner's strategic brilliance crumbled like sand when faced with supernatural authority that rendered all human planning irrelevant. Her wolf tried to mount some kind of coordinated attack, circling with the patient calculation that had won her reputation and respect across multiple kingdoms. But when Lyra simply looked at her with silver eyes that burned with starfire, Elena's carefully constructed confidence shattered like glass. She submitted without the Silver Queen even drawing her blade. But it was Elder Marcus whose defeat carried the most profound satisfaction. The man who had spent 18 years tormenting and degrading her now faced the full weight of royal justice, and she watched his arrogance crumble as he finally understood exactly what he had been persecuting. Every cruel word, every denied comfort, every moment of deliberate humiliation was now placed in its proper context. He had not been disciplining a worthless servant, he had been torturing a queen. "Your crimes against the royal bloodline are noted," she said, her voice carrying the authority of ancient law and supernatural power combined. "But mercy is also a royal prerogative, and I choose to grant you exile rather than the death your actions have earned." The pack that had assembled to witness her trial now knelt before their true queen, and she felt their submission like a wave of warmth that washed away 18 years of rejection and invisibility. These were her people, bound to her by laws older than kingdoms, and for the first time in her life she felt the profound satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged. But it was the Alpha King's response that mattered most. He approached her with fluid grace, his silver eyes bright with wonder and fierce pride as he took in her transformed state. The mate bond that connected them blazed with golden fire, but now it carried additional resonance that spoke of perfect equality rather than the painful asymmetry that had characterized their earlier connection. She was no longer his hidden weakness that political necessity demanded he deny. She was his equal in every way that mattered, a queen whose authority complemented his own. "My queen," he said, dropping to one knee before her with the reverence due to royalty, while his eyes promised intimate devotion that went far beyond political alliance. "My mate, my partner in all things." The formal claiming ceremony that followed was a masterpiece of supernatural power and political necessity perfectly aligned. Ancient rituals that had been dormant for 18 years blazed back to life as she accepted the crown that had been waiting for her return, and every wolf present felt the shift in cosmic order as the lost royal line was finally restored. The Silver Queen's throne, hidden in chambers that had been sealed since her parents' murder, recognized her touch and opened to reveal the seat of power that was her birthright. But when the Alpha King joined her on the raised dais, when he placed his hand over hers on the ancient armrest carved from star silver and moonstone, something unprecedented happened. Instead of the traditional subordination of male to female royal, or the conquest of one throne by another, their combined power created something entirely new. a dual monarchy that merged their authorities into something greater than either could achieve alone. The political ramifications were staggering, and they both knew it. Every treaty, every alliance, every carefully negotiated balance of power in the Northern Territories would need to be reconsidered in light of the restored Silver Throne and its unexpected alliance with the established Alpha King. But as they sat together in perfect synchronization, their wolves content and their bond blazing with satisfied completion, neither of them could bring themselves to regret the chaos their union would undoubtedly create. Celesta's reaction to her complete political defeat was a study in gracious surrender masking furious calculation. She stepped forward to offer the traditional acknowledgement due to proven royalty, her amber eyes bright with something that might have been respect if it had not been layered over with obvious thoughts of future revenge. The 18-year plan that had brought her to this moment had crumbled in spectacular fashion, but she was already adapting to the new reality with the efficiency that had made her so dangerous in the first place. "Your Majesty," she said with a perfect curtsy that carried just enough deference to satisfy protocol while maintaining her own dignity. "I offer my congratulations on your successful trial and my apologies for any inconvenience my challenge may have caused. Perhaps we might discuss the terms of my withdrawal from territorial politics at your convenience." The request was reasonable, even generous given the circumstances, and Lyra felt the weight of royal responsibility settle onto her shoulders as she considered how to respond to someone who had tried to murder her, but was now offering peaceful resolution. The Silver Queen's sword still hummed with power at her side, ready to deliver justice with a single stroke. But mercy was also a royal virtue that separated true leaders from tyrants. "You will leave these territories immediately," she said, her voice carrying the authority that made disobedience impossible. "Your engagement to the Alpha King is dissolved, your political alliances in the northern kingdoms are void, and you will not return to these lands while I live. In exchange, you retain your life and your freedom to build whatever future awaits you beyond our borders." It was a generous offer given the scope of Celeste's crimes, and they both knew it. Exile rather than execution, freedom rather than imprisonment, the chance to start over somewhere else rather than facing the supernatural justice that her attempted regicide had earned. But as Celeste accepted the terms with elegant grace, Lyra could see in her eyes that this defeat was being filed away as a temporary setback rather than a permanent conclusion. The wedding ceremony that crowned their triumph took place 3 days later, witnessed by representatives from every major pack in the Northern Territories who had travelled to acknowledge the restored Silver Throne and pledge their loyalty to the new dual monarchy. Ancient vows were spoken in languages that predated human kingdoms, binding their souls together with chains of starlight and moonfire that would endure beyond death itself. When the Alpha King kissed his Silver Queen before the assembled witnesses, sealing their union with supernatural light that made the very air shimmer with power, every wolf present felt the cosmic rightness of the match. This was not political convenience or strategic alliance. This was destiny made manifest, two halves of a greater whole finally united in the bond that had been written in the stars before their birth. But it was the private moment that followed, when they retired to the royal chambers that had been prepared for their joint rule, that carried the most profound significance. "I love you," he whispered against her lips as silver light danced around them in lazy spirals. "Not because you are my queen, not because you carry the royal bloodline, but because you are the other half of my soul that I have been searching for my entire life." "And I love you," she replied, feeling the mate bond pulse with golden fire that spoke of eternal devotion and perfect understanding. "Because you saw who I truly was when the rest of the world had made me invisible, and because you chose me over every political advantage you could have gained by walking away." Outside their window, the Northern Territories stretched out under starlight, lands that would now be ruled by love rather than conquest, by partnership rather than domination. The Silver Queen and her Alpha King had claimed their throne together, and the world would never be the same. But in the darkness beyond their borders, amber eyes watched and waited, calculating new approaches to an old obsession that refused to die with a single defeat. The crown had been reclaimed, the bond had been sealed, but the story was far from over. 6 months had transformed the Northern Territories in ways that no one could have predicted. Lyra stood on the balcony of the royal chambers that had become her sanctuary, watching the morning sun cast silver light across lands that now prospered under the dual monarchy she and her mate had established together. The pack compound that had once been her prison had become the seat of a new kind of power, one built on protection rather than domination, on partnership rather than conquest. But it was the changes in herself that still took her breath away when she caught glimpses of her reflection in the ancient mirrors that lined the royal halls. The Silver Queen who looked back at her bore little resemblance to the broken servant who had once scrubbed floors and endured daily humiliation with practiced invisibility. Silver light danced permanently beneath her skin now, a constant reminder of the royal bloodline that had finally claimed its birthright. Her wolf, once restless and uncertain, now moved through her consciousness with the fluid confidence of something that had found its purpose in the world. She was no longer the girl who whimpered in fear or growled in defiance. She was the wolf who had found her voice. The Alpha King's arms came around her from behind, and she felt the familiar warmth of the mate bond settle into perfect contentment as he pulled her back against his chest. Their connection had deepened with time and shared responsibility, growing from desperate recognition into something that felt as natural as breathing. "What has captured your attention so completely this morning?" he murmured against her ear, his breath warm on her skin as he followed her gaze across the territories they ruled together. "The messenger that arrived before dawn," she replied, leaning into his strength while her mind processed the implications of the news that had disrupted their peaceful morning. 3 kingdoms to the south are questioning the legitimacy of our rule. They claim that the restoration of the Silver Throne disrupts treaties that have kept the region stable for decades, and they are demanding proof that our authority extends beyond supernatural recognition. She felt him tense behind her as he calculated the political ramifications of organised opposition to their joint reign. They had expected some resistance to the changes their union had brought to the established order, but 3 kingdoms working together represented a threat that could not be dismissed or resolved through diplomatic channels alone. "They want war," he said, and it was not a question. His wolf stirred with protective instincts that would never allow challenges to his mate's authority to go unanswered, and she felt her own power respond with silver light that made the morning air shimmer around them. They want to test whether the Silver Queen is a political convenience that will crumble under pressure, or a supernatural force that can reshape the balance of power across multiple kingdoms, she corrected gently. The distinction matters because our response will determine how every other territorial leader views our authority going forward. The challenge that faced them was more complex than simple military conquest. Royal legitimacy in the supernatural world required more than bloodline and power. It demanded the kind of recognition that could only be earned through trials that proved worthiness to rule over creatures whose loyalty had to be inspired rather than commanded. But as they stood together on the balcony that overlooked their domain, she felt no fear of the coming conflict. The girl who had once risked everything to prove her worth to a pack that barely tolerated her existence was gone, replaced by a queen who understood that true strength came not from inspiring fear, but from inspiring love. The War Council that convened that afternoon brought together allies whose loyalty had been earned through the transformed leadership style that marked their joint reign. Martha, now elevated to royal advisor, with chambers befitting her years of secret protection and guidance. Pack members who had once dismissed Lyra as worthless now served as her most devoted guardians, having witnessed firsthand the transition from hidden potential to blazing reality. Even former enemies had found places in the new order, their expertise valued despite their previous opposition. elder Marcus, granted clemency in exchange for his intimate knowledge of regional politics, now served as a strategic consultant whose insights proved invaluable when planning defensive measures. The three kingdoms that challenged their authority had made a crucial miscalculation, one that spoke of fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the power they faced. They expected political manoeuvring and military strategy, the kind of conflict that could be won through superior numbers and better supply lines. But the Silver Queen's authority was not political, it was cosmic, written into the supernatural laws that governed the relationship between wolves and the ancient magic that bound them to the natural world. When she chose to demonstrate that authority, the results would be beyond anything human kingdoms could prepare for or resist. The demonstration came 3 weeks later, when the combined armies of the challenging kingdoms crossed into Northern Territory, with banners flying and war horns sounding their intent to conquer or destroy the upstart monarchy that threatened their established order. They met the Silver Queen on a battlefield that she had chosen, open ground where her power could manifest without restraint, and every soldier in every army could witness what they were truly facing. She rode onto the field alone, silver light blazing around her like captured starfire, her wolf visible just beneath her human form as a creature of moonlight and ancient magic. The opposing armies, thousands of warriors who had marched north with confidence in their superior numbers, fell silent as supernatural authority washed over them in waves that made the very air tremble with power. Horses shied and whinnied in terror, sensing predatory force that operated according to laws older than human civilization. When she spoke, her voice carried across the battlefield with perfect clarity, reaching every ear despite the vast distances involved. I am the Silver Queen, last heir of the bloodline that ruled these territories before your kingdoms existed, and I offer you one opportunity to withdraw before demonstrating why your ancestors paid tribute to my crown for 1,000 years. The challenge was delivered with the formal courtesy due to worthy opponents, but everyone present could feel the supernatural power backing her words. This was not political negotiation or diplomatic posturing. This was a force of nature offering mercy to those wise enough to accept it. The southern kings chose poorly. Their attack came with the coordination and discipline of professional armies, thousands of warriors advancing with shields locked and weapons ready to overwhelm a single opponent through sheer numerical advantage. But when the Silver Queen's power fully manifested, when ancient magic blazed across the battlefield like the wrath of forgotten gods, the concept of numerical advantage became meaningless. Silver light erupted from her position with enough force to crack the earth beneath her feet, and every wolf within 10 miles felt the call of absolute authority that demanded submission from everything it encountered. The attacking armies, filled with wolves who had been trained to follow human commanders rather than supernatural leaders, suddenly found their deepest instincts overriding their military discipline. They knelt, all of them, thousands of warriors dropping to the ground as their wolves recognized the apex predator that stood before them, the royal bloodline that commanded obedience from every member of their species regardless of political loyalty or military oath. The battle was over before it truly began, ended not through violence, but through the simple demonstration of power that rendered all human ambitions irrelevant. The Silver Queen stood alone on a battlefield filled with kneeling armies, and when she spoke again, her words carried the authority of cosmic law. "You came north to test whether my authority was real," she said, silver light still dancing around her like living flame. "The question has been answered. Return to your kingdoms and tell your leaders that the silver throne has been restored, and that those who choose alliance over conquest will find prosperity, while those who choose aggression will find submission." The withdrawal of the southern armies marked a turning point that echoed across the supernatural world, establishing the restored silver throne as a force that could reshape regional politics through sheer supernatural authority rather than military conquest. but it was the personal cost of such demonstrations that weighed most heavily on her heart. Power of this magnitude came with responsibilities that extended far beyond personal happiness, and she felt the burden of cosmic authority settling onto her shoulders with increasing weight. Every decision she made affected thousands of lives, and the consequences of ruling through supernatural force rather than human politics created complexities that kept her awake during the long nights when even the mate bond could not provide complete comfort. But when she returned to the Alpha King's arms after the battlefield victory, when he held her close and whispered words of fierce pride and eternal devotion, she remembered why the burden was worth carrying. She had not sought power for its own sake, but to protect those she loved and create a world where others would never have to endure the invisibility and rejection that had marked her early years. The pregnancy announcement came 2 months later, delivered with the quiet joy of those who had found perfect love and were ready to share that gift with the next generation. Royal heirs who would grow up knowing their worth from birth, who would inherit a world where strength was measured by the capacity to protect rather than the ability to dominate. Standing together on the balcony where they had planned their response to southern aggression, watching silver moonlight dance across territories that now thrived under their joint rule, Lyra finally understood what Martha had meant years ago when she had said that she was not what they had told her she was. She had never been broken. She had been hidden, protected until the time came for her awakening and the fulfillment of destiny that had been written in starlight before her birth. The Silver Queen and her Alpha King had found their throne, claimed their love, and built their legacy. But most importantly, they had learned that true power came not from inspiring fear, but from inspiring hope. 2 years had taught her the difference between surviving and truly living. Lyra stood in the royal nursery, silver light dancing gently around her fingers as she watched her children sleep in their carved cradles of star silver and moonstone. Twin heirs to the silver throne, a daughter whose eyes already held flecks of starfire, and a son whose wolf stirred with royal power that would reshape the world when he came of age. They would never know the invisibility she had endured, never question their worth or their place in a world that had been transformed by love rather than conquered through fear. The mate bond pulsed with warm contentment as the Alpha King joined her in the quiet sanctuary they had created for their family, his presence settling around her like the most perfect embrace. 2 years of ruling together had only deepened their connection, transforming desperate recognition into something that felt as natural and essential as breathing itself. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked softly, his voice barely disturbing the peaceful silence that surrounded their sleeping children. "The simplicity of the time before you knew who you truly were." She considered the question with the kind of deep reflection that had become natural to her during the quiet hours when royal responsibilities gave way to intimate conversation. The girl who had scrubbed floors and endured daily humiliation felt like someone she had known in another lifetime, a stranger whose pain she could remember but no longer truly feel. "I miss the certainty of invisibility sometimes," she admitted, watching silver light play across her daughter's peaceful features. "There was a strange comfort in believing I was nothing, in having no expectations or responsibilities beyond simple survival, but I would not trade who I have become for that false safety, not when the alternative is this." She gestured toward the nursery that represented everything they had built together, but her meaning encompassed far more than the physical space. Their children, their kingdom, their love that had survived every political obstacle and supernatural trial the world had thrown against them. The transformation from outcast servant to beloved queen had been painful and terrifying, and absolutely worth every moment of struggle. The northern territories thrived under their joint rule in ways that chroniclers would write about for centuries to come. Trade flourished between kingdoms that had once viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. Pack hierarchies had evolved from rigid dominance structures into communities that valued protection over power, cooperation over conquest. The culture of cruelty that had once defined her world had given way to something that prioritized compassion without sacrificing strength. But it was the personal transformations that mattered most to her heart. Martha, elevated to royal advisor and treated with the respect her years of secret devotion had earned, now moved through the royal chambers with the confidence of someone whose worth had finally been acknowledged by the world. Former servants who had shown her kindness during the darkest period of her life now held positions of honor in the royal household, their loyalty rewarded with trust and responsibility. Even some of those who had once tormented her had found redemption through service to the transformed kingdom, learning that strength could be channeled toward protection rather than domination. The culture of fear that had once governed pack relationships had been replaced by something that inspired the best in everyone it touched. The anniversary of their first meeting had become a celebration throughout the kingdom, marked not as a royal holiday, but as a reminder that love could triumph over every obstacle when it was backed by courage and determination. She thought of that day often during quiet moments like this, remembering the injured wolf who had growled at an entire pack before whimpering when the Alpha King approached. That wolf had been waiting for recognition, for someone who could see past the wounds and the defiance to the royal soul that had been hidden beneath years of suppression and denial. The Alpha King had provided that recognition, but the strength to claim her birthright had come from within, from the part of her that had refused to break despite every cruelty the world had inflicted. Her daughter stirred in her sleep, tiny hands reaching toward the silver light that danced around her mother's fingers, and Lyra felt her heart expand with fierce protective love that encompassed not just her children, but every vulnerable soul in the kingdom they ruled together. This was what true power meant, not the ability to dominate or destroy, but the capacity to protect and nurture those who depended on your strength. The Alpha King's arms came around her from behind, and she leaned into his warmth while their combined presence seemed to make the nursery glow with contentment. Their children would grow up knowing they were loved unconditionally, knowing their worth was inherent rather than something that had to be proven through suffering or sacrifice. "You are thinking deep thoughts again," he murmured against her hair, and she could hear the affectionate smile in his voice. "What profound wisdom is occupying the mind of my brilliant queen this evening?" "I was thinking about endings and beginnings," she replied, turning in his arms so she could see his face in the silver light that had become as natural as moonbeams. About how the girl who believed she was nothing became the woman who learned she was everything. About how love can transform not just individuals, but entire worlds when it is given the chance to flourish. His silver eyes held depths of understanding that came from sharing every joy and sorrow of the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect peace. He had been her anchor during the storms of awakening power and political upheaval, her partner in every decision that had shaped their kingdom, her mate in every sense that mattered to both human hearts and supernatural souls. "And what conclusions have you reached about endings and beginnings?" he asked, his hands coming up to frame her face with the tenderness that had never diminished despite the weight of crowns and the responsibility of thrones. "That they are the same thing," she said, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones with perfect certainty. Every ending creates space for a new beginning, and every beginning carries the seeds of transformation that will eventually require another ending. The girl I was had to end, so the woman I became could begin. Our old lives had to end, so our shared life could begin. She paused, looking at their sleeping children who represented the ultimate beginning that their love had created. The future that would carry forward everything they had built together while adding new chapters that neither of them could predict or control. "I am no longer the wolf who whimpered in fear or growled in defiance," she continued, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had replaced years of desperate uncertainty. "I am the wolf who found her voice and learned that true strength comes not from inspiring fear, but from inspiring love. From creating a world where others can find their own voices without having to endure the darkness that once seemed inevitable." Outside the nursery windows, the northern territories stretched away under starlight, lands that would continue to prosper long after she and her mate had passed into legend. Their children would inherit a world transformed by love rather than scarred by conquest, and those children would pass that legacy forward to generations yet unborn. The mate bond that had begun with impossible recognition in a pack courtyard now encompassed everything that truly mattered. Love that had been tested by political necessity and strengthened by supernatural trial. Partnership that had created a new model of leadership based on cooperation rather than domination. Legacy that would outlive their individual lives and reshape the world for centuries to come. But in this quiet moment, surrounded by the evidence of everything they had built together, she was not the Silver Queen or the transformed ruler of vast territories. She was simply a woman who had found her other half, who had learned to love herself as fiercely as she loved her family, who had discovered that the greatest power in any world was the capacity to inspire hope in others. When she finally spoke again, her words carried the weight of absolute truth, discovered through trials that had burned away everything false and left only what was eternal. "I am no longer the girl who believed she was broken," she whispered, and felt the words settle into the peaceful silence like a benediction. "I am the woman who learned she was whole, who found her place in a world that tried to convince her she had no value, who discovered that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the gentlest touch." The Alpha King's response was a kiss that tasted of starlight and forever, sealing the truth they had both learned through love that had refused to be denied by political necessity or supernatural impossibility. They had found their throne, claimed their crown, and built their legacy. But most importantly, they had learned that true power came not from conquering others, but from conquering the fears and limitations that prevented love from flourishing in a world that desperately needed its transformative grace. The Silver Queen and her Alpha King stood together in the nursery that held their future, surrounded by the evidence of love made manifest, and knew that they had written a story worthy of the stars that had witnessed its beginning in a pack courtyard where impossible recognition had changed the world forever. The storage room smelled of old grain and abandonment, but it was the scent of her own blood that dominated the small space as Lyra pressed her back against the cold stone wall. 3 hours had passed since they had thrown her in here, and the wounds along her ribs had begun to seep through the makeshift bandages she had torn from her shift. Each breath sent fire racing through her damaged shoulder, but the pack healer's refusal to treat her meant that she would heal slowly, naturally, or not at all. Her wolf paced restlessly beneath her skin, agitated by the pain and the injustice of their situation. It had been doing that more often lately, moving with a fluid grace that did not match the awkward, clumsy way she moved through the world in human form. Sometimes she caught glimpses of silver light in her peripheral vision when her wolf stirred, brief flashes that disappeared the moment she tried to focus on them. The other pack members' wolves never did that. Theirs were earth tones, browns and greys that blended with the forest, practical colours that spoke of hunting and survival. But hers had always been different, difficult, wrong. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made her tense, expecting another visit from Elder Marcus or one of the other pack leaders come to deliver additional punishment. Instead, she heard the soft whisper of bare feet and caught the familiar scent of bread and herbs that meant Martha, the head cook, was approaching. The door opened just wide enough for the older woman to slip inside, carrying a wooden bowl and a small clay jar that promised relief. Martha had been kind to her when kindness was a luxury the pack could barely afford. She was a widow with no children of her own, and perhaps that made her more inclined toward mercy when it came to the pack's unwanted foundling. She knelt beside Lyra without speaking, her weathered hands gentle as they examined the claw marks with professional efficiency. "This is deeper than it should be," Martha murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. These rogues, they were not ordinary exiles. Their claws carried something some infection that prevents proper healing. She opened the clay jar, and the sharp scent of healing salve filled the air, mixed with herbs that Lyra did not recognize. But there was something else in Martha's expression, a concern that went deeper than worry over infected wounds. "What is it?" Lyra asked, wincing as Martha began to clean the injuries with careful precision. "What are you not telling me?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, her hands working with practiced skill as she applied the salve to each wound. When she finally spoke, her words were barely audible. "Your wolf, child. When you were fighting those rogues, did it do anything unusual? Anything that might have confused them?" The memory of the rogues' sudden stillness came flooding back, their expressions shifting from aggression to bewilderment as they scented the air around her. She had been too focused on survival in the moment to think about it clearly, but now, with Martha's gentle probing, she began to understand that what had happened was not normal pack behavior. "They stopped fighting," Lyra said slowly. "They smelled me and just stopped, like they recognized something they did not expect to find, like they were afraid." Martha's hand stilled on her shoulder, and when she looked up, there was something in her eyes that looked almost like recognition. Or perhaps it was fear. The older woman glanced toward the door, as if checking to make sure they were still alone, and then leaned closer with the conspiratorial air of someone about to reveal a dangerous secret. "Your parents," she whispered, and the words hit Lyra like a physical blow. Martha had never spoken of her parents before, had never given any indication that she knew anything about Lyra's origins beyond the story everyone had been told, that she had been found as an infant on the pack's borders, abandoned by rogues, or perhaps by a pack that could not afford another mouth to feed. "What about my parents?" Lyra breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs hard enough to make her wounds ache. But Martha was already standing, her moment of revelation seemingly over as quickly as it had begun. She pressed the clay jar into Lyra's hands with urgent efficiency, her expression closing off like shutters being drawn across a window. "Use this twice daily until the wounds close completely," she said in her normal voice, all trace of conspiracy gone. "And stay away from the other pack members until the Alpha King's visit is concluded. There are already whispers about your punishment, and some of them are not kind." She was gone before Lyra could ask any of the 1,000 questions that were suddenly burning in her throat, leaving her alone with the scent of healing herbs and the terrible, desperate hope that maybe, finally, someone might have answers about who she really was. But even as she applied Martha's salve to her wounds and felt the infection begin to recede, her wolf continued its restless pacing, like it was listening for something specific. Night fell with cruel efficiency, and with it came the voices. They drifted through the thin walls from the common areas where pack members gathered after their evening meal, discussing the day's events and speculating about tomorrow's arrival of the Alpha King. But it was not excitement she heard in their voices. It was anger and disappointment, and a cold calculation that made her blood run chill in her veins. "She should be exiled," Elder Marcus was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the stone. "The girl has proven beyond doubt that she cannot be trusted to follow even the most basic pack rules. Her reckless actions could have brought disaster on all of us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, punctuated by individual voices adding their own condemnation. She had always known she was not wanted, but hearing it spoken so plainly still felt like claws raking across her heart. She pressed her ear to the wall, desperate to hear if anyone would speak in her defence, but the voices that rose were uniformly harsh. The beta wolves were the worst. Marcus's son, David, and his packmates had always taken particular pleasure in reminding her of her place, but tonight their cruelty had a sharper edge. "She thinks she is some kind of warrior," David laughed, and the sound was like broken glass. "Did you see the way she limped back here, crying like a pup that had wandered too far from its den? Maybe the rogues did us a favour by giving her a taste of what real fighting looks like." More laughter, bitter and mocking, and Lyra felt her wolf surge upward in response to the insults. But instead of the submission she expected, instead of the cowering acceptance that had been her wolf's response to pack hierarchy for as long as she could remember. She felt something else entirely. Her wolf lifted its head with regal composure and looked at the wall as if it could see through stone, as if it was measuring the worth of the speakers and finding them lacking. The sensation was so unexpected, so completely at odds with everything she understood about her place in the world, that she actually pulled back from the wall in shock. Her wolf had never shown defiance like this before. It had always been as beaten down as she was, as resigned to their shared fate at the bottom of the pack structure. But now it moved through her mind like it owned the space, like it was merely tolerating the insults rather than internalizing them. She spent the hours until dawn trying to understand what was happening to her, but every time she thought she was close to an answer, her wolf would shift and settle like it was keeping secrets. The strange voice from her fever dreams whispered at the edges of her consciousness, speaking words in a language she did not recognize but somehow understood. Ancient words that spoke of waiting, of recognition, of a time when the hidden would be revealed and the lost would find their way home. When morning finally arrived, it brought news that changed everything. Martha appeared at her door just after sunrise, carrying a breakfast tray and an expression of barely contained anxiety. She set the food down with shaking hands and looked around the small room as if checking for listeners, even though they both knew the storage room was isolated from the rest of the compound. "The Alpha King arrives at midday," she said, without preamble. "The entire pack is to assemble in the main courtyard for his address. You are to remain here, out of sight, until the pack elders determine your final punishment." Lyra felt her wolf react to the news with something that felt like anticipation, a thrumming excitement that made no sense given their circumstances. The Alpha King was the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories, a creature of legend whose authority superseded every pack law and hierarchy. His visit was an honour beyond measure for their small pack, but it was also terrifying. Kings did not travel to remote territories without cause, and his presence here meant that something significant was happening, something that might change everything. Martha lingered in the doorway, her expression conflicted as she watched Lyra's face. There was something she wanted to say, some piece of information or advice that she was struggling to deliver. Finally, she stepped back into the room and closed the door behind her with deliberate finality. "Child," she said, and her voice carried a weight that made Lyra look up sharply. "When the Alpha King arrives, when his presence fills this place with power that makes the air itself tremble, I need you to remember something important. You are not what they have told you that you are. You are not the broken thing they have made you believe yourself to be." The words hit Lyra like lightning, carrying implications that she was afraid to examine too closely. Before she could respond, before she could ask what Martha meant or how she could know such things, the older woman was gone again, leaving her alone with questions that felt too dangerous to pursue, and hope that felt too fragile to trust. But her wolf was no longer pacing. Instead, it had settled into a position that looked almost like waiting, its attention focused outward towards something that had not yet arrived. And in the distance, carried on the morning wind, she heard the sound she had been unconsciously listening for since the moment they had locked her away. Howls, deep and powerful and ancient, growing closer with each passing hour. The Alpha King was coming, and her wolf seemed to know something about what that meant that she did not. Something that might finally provide answers to questions she had never dared to ask. The Alpha King's arrival shattered the morning like thunder breaking across a clear sky. Lyra felt his presence before she heard the commotion in the courtyard, a pressure that seemed to press against her ribs from the inside and make her wolf lift its head with sudden, sharp attention. Power rolled off him in waves that penetrated even the thick stone walls of her makeshift prison, and she found herself pressing her palms against the floor as if she could somehow ground herself against the overwhelming force of his authority. Through the narrow window high in the wall, she could hear the pack assembling with frantic efficiency. Voices called out orders and confirmations as pack members rushed to present themselves in the main courtyard, their usual casual hierarchy dissolving into rigid formality under the weight of royal presence. She had never seen the Alpha King before, had only heard whispered stories of his legendary strength and the way entire battlefields fell silent when he chose to reveal his true form. But even trapped in her stone prison, she could feel the truth of those legends pressing down on her like a physical thing. Her wolf was going insane. That was the only way to describe the restless energy that suddenly consumed her, making her pace the small confines of the storage room like a caged animal that had caught the scent of something impossible. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run toward the source of that overwhelming presence, to throw herself at the locked door until her hands bled, to find some way to reach the courtyard where history was being made without her. But beneath the desperate urge to flee her prison, something else stirred, something that felt almost like recognition, as if her wolf knew exactly who had arrived and had been waiting for this moment longer than she could possibly understand. The sound of his voice carried through the stone walls with perfect clarity, and she felt her breath catch in her throat at the first word. Deep, commanding, absolute authority wrapped in velvet darkness that made every nerve ending in her body come alive at once. He was addressing the pack leadership, but she could not make out the individual words over the hammering of her own heart and the strange ringing in her ears that seemed to accompany the wolf's frantic pacing. All she knew was that his voice moved through her like liquid fire, awakening parts of her consciousness that had never stirred before. Then the courtyard fell silent, not the natural quiet of a crowd listening respectfully, but the profound, breathless stillness that came when something impossible had just occurred. Even through the walls, she could feel the shock radiating outward, like ripples on disturbed water, and her wolf stopped pacing abruptly to focus its attention on something she could not see. "What happened?" she whispered to the empty room, but her wolf provided no answers. It had gone perfectly still, in a way that reminded her of a predator preparing to strike, every sense focused outward with laser intensity. And then, impossibly, she heard her name being spoken in that voice of liquid authority. "Bring her to me." The words cut through the stone walls like they were made of silk, and she felt her entire world shift on its axis. The Alpha King knew her name. More than that, he was asking for her specifically, singling her out from an entire pack of worthy wolves to demand her presence before his throne. It made no sense. She was nobody, less than nobody, a burden that the pack barely tolerated and had been planning to exile only hours before. But her wolf knew better. As footsteps approached her door with urgent efficiency, her wolf settled into a position that looked almost like preparation. Not the cowering submission she had expected, not the terror that should have accompanied a summons from the most powerful creature in the Northern Territories, but something that felt almost like anticipation, like it had been waiting for this moment its entire life and was finally ready to step into the light. The door opened to reveal Elder Marcus, but the arrogant authority that usually radiated from him had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. His hands shook as he fumbled with the key, and when he looked at her, she saw confusion and growing dread in his expression. "The Alpha King has requested your immediate presence," he said, and his voice carried none of its usual condescension. "You will come now, and you will show proper respect, or I swear by the ancient laws that govern us all, I will see you exiled before the sun sets." But even as he delivered the threat, she could see that his heart was not in it. Something had happened in the courtyard, something that had shifted the balance of power in ways that Elder Marcus was still trying to understand. She rose to her feet with careful dignity, ignoring the pain that shot through her wounded shoulder, and followed him into the corridor that led toward whatever destiny was waiting for her in the morning light. The courtyard was a tableau of frozen shock. Every member of the pack stood in perfect formation, their heads bowed in submission and their eyes fixed on the ground as if they were afraid to look directly at the figure commanding their attention. But even with their gazes averted, she could feel their awareness of her presence like a physical weight as Elder Marcus led her through their ranks toward the raised platform where the pack leaders usually conducted their business. And there, dominating the space like he had been carved from shadow and starlight, stood the Alpha King. He was larger than she had expected, though she had heard the stories of his size and strength for most of her life. But it was not his physical presence that stole her breath. It was the way power seemed to radiate from him in visible waves, distorting the air around him like heat rising from sun-warmed stone. His hair was dark as midnight, and his skin carried the warm bronze of someone who spent his life in the wilderness. But it was his eyes that made her wolf whine softly in the back of her mind. Silver, like moonlight on water, like starfire given form, and when they focused on her as she approached the platform, she felt the world narrow to that single point of connection. Everything else faded into background noise, the pack, the courtyard, even her own fear disappearing under the weight of impossible recognition. He knew her. Somehow, impossibly, the Alpha King looked at her like he had been searching for her his entire life and had finally found what he was looking for. His wolf was visible just beneath the surface of his human form, a massive silver-white creature that seemed to fill the space around him with barely contained power, and she watched in amazement as it lifted its head and called to something deep inside her consciousness. Her wolf answered. The sound that came from her throat was part whimper, part recognition, part desperate plea that she did not understand. But the Alpha King understood. She watched his expression shift from formal authority to something raw and vulnerable, something that looked almost like relief, and when he took a step toward her, the entire courtyard seemed to hold its breath. "You," he said, and his voice carried a wonder that made her heart skip beats in her chest. "It has been you all along." She had no idea what he meant, no context for the recognition that blazed in his silver eyes, or the way his wolf seemed to be reaching for hers across the space that separated them. But as he descended from the platform with fluid grace and approached her with the focused intensity of a predator who had finally cornered his prey, she felt her wolf surge upward in response, and for the first time in her life it did not cower. Instead, her wolf lifted its head with something that looked almost like pride, something that spoke of bloodlines and destiny and ancient promises that had been waiting years to be fulfilled. The Alpha King stopped just close enough to touch, his silver eyes searching her face like he was memorizing every detail, and when he spoke again, his words were barely above a whisper. "What is your name?" he asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Lyra," she breathed, and watched something shift in his face at the sound of it, like hearing her voice had confirmed something he had suspected, but not dared to hope. "Lyra," he repeated, and the way he said it made her name sound like a prayer, like something sacred that had been lost and was now finally found. Behind them, she could hear the pack stirring with growing confusion and alarm, but the Alpha King's attention remained fixed on her with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade into insignificance. "You defended the borders," he said, "and it was not a question. You fought rogues that had crossed into pack territory, and you drove them back despite being outnumbered and untrained." She nodded, not trusting her voice to work properly under the weight of his attention. Something was happening here that went far beyond simple royal interest in a border skirmish, something that made her wolf pace with barely contained excitement and filled her chest with hope so dangerous it felt like drowning. "Tell me what happened when they scented you," the Alpha King commanded, and this time his voice carried the full weight of royal authority that demanded absolute truth. "Tell me why 3 experienced rogues chose to flee from one injured wolf instead of finishing what they had started." The memory came flooding back with perfect clarity, every detail sharp and immediate as she relived those moments of impossible victory. The way the rogues had stopped mid-attack, their expressions shifting from aggression to bewilderment as they breathed in her scent. The fear that had crept into their eyes as they circled her with growing confusion, like they had encountered something they recognized but had never expected to find in such a small, unremarkable wolf. "They smelled me and stopped fighting," she said, her voice barely audible in the profound silence that had settled over the courtyard, like they recognized something that confused them, like they were afraid of what they found. The Alpha King nodded slowly, his silver eyes never leaving her face as he processed her words, and in the growing silence she became aware that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between them. He was no longer looking at her like she was a servant reporting to her king. He was looking at her like she was something precious that had been lost and was now finally found, like she was something he had been searching for his entire life. Elder Marcus cleared his throat behind them, clearly struggling to understand what was happening and growing more desperate by the moment to reassert some kind of control over the situation. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice tight with barely concealed panic. "This girl has been a problem for our pack since the day she arrived. Her reckless actions have endangered our security and defied our most basic rules. We were preparing to exile her before your arrival." The Alpha King turned to look at Elder Marcus, and the temperature in the courtyard seemed to drop several degrees. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that was more terrifying than any shout. "You were preparing to exile her," he repeated, and there was something in his tone that made Elder Marcus take an involuntary step backward. "The wolf who single-handedly defended your territory from rogues while your own hunters slept safely in their beds. The wolf who risked her life to protect packlands that had never shown her an ounce of kindness or recognition." Elder Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but the Alpha King held up one hand, and the older wolf fell silent immediately. Around them, Lyra could feel the pack's growing awareness that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would change the fundamental structure of everything they thought they understood about power and hierarchy and worth. "We will speak privately," the Alpha King said, his gaze returning to Lyra with an intensity that made her wolf whine softly in recognition. "All of us, now." And as he turned toward the pack house, with the fluid grace of absolute authority, she felt her world shift on its axis one final time. Whatever was about to happen in that private meeting, whatever revelations were waiting in the darkness of political necessity and royal prerogative, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. Her wolf settled into perfect stillness, finally at peace after a lifetime of restless waiting. The recognition was complete. The pack leader's private chamber had never felt so small. Elder Marcus hovered near the doorway, like he was afraid to venture further into the room, while the Alpha King commanded the space with effortless authority, his presence making the stone walls seem to press inward. Lyra stood between them, acutely aware that she was the centre of a conflict she did not fully understand, her injured wolf trembling beneath her skin with a mixture of fear and impossible recognition. The king had dismissed all other witnesses with a gesture that brooked no argument, leaving the three of them alone with questions that hung in the air like smoke. But it was not Elder Marcus that the Alpha King was watching. His silver eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel transparent, like he could see through flesh and bone to examine the wolf that paced restlessly in the depths of her consciousness. "Show me your wounds," he commanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made disobedience impossible. "Your Majesty," Elder Marcus began, stepping forward with obvious discomfort, "the girl's injuries are not severe enough to warrant your personal attention. Our pack healer determined that natural healing would be sufficient punishment for her reckless actions." The Alpha King turned to look at Elder Marcus, and the older wolf actually took a step backward under the weight of that silver stare. "Your pack healer refused to treat defensive wounds sustained while protecting territory that your own hunters failed to patrol," he said, and there was something in his tone that made the air itself seem to vibrate with barely contained power. "That is what you are telling me." Elder Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The excuse that had seemed reasonable hours earlier now sounded petty and cruel when spoken aloud in the presence of true authority, and Lyra watched his face flush with growing embarrassment as the full implications of their treatment became clear. "The wounds," the Alpha King repeated, returning his attention to her with laser focus. "Show me." Her hands shook as she lifted the edge of her torn shirt, revealing the claw marks that ran along her ribs like angry red furrows. The infection had begun to recede under Martha's careful treatment, but the wounds were still deep and ugly, speaking of violence and pain that should have killed her. She heard the Alpha King's sharp intake of breath as he took in the full extent of the damage, and when she looked up, his expression had shifted from curiosity to something that looked dangerously close to rage. He approached her with careful precision, his movements fluid and controlled as he examined the injuries with eyes that missed nothing. "These were made by rogues carrying cursed claws," he said, and his voice was deadly quiet. "Weapons designed to prevent healing and cause maximum suffering. You fought 3 of them with wounds like this." It was not a question, but she nodded anyway, mesmerized by the way his presence seemed to calm her wolf's restless pacing. Up close, she could see the silver flecks in his dark hair and the way power seemed to shimmer just beneath his skin like captured lightning. He smelled like winter forests and ancient magic, and her wolf pressed upward against her consciousness like it was trying to get closer to that impossible scent. His hand moved to hover just above her shoulder, not quite touching but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. And something impossible happened. The constant ache that had plagued her since the fight began to recede, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire body like golden honey. Her wounds, still visible and angry, began to close with supernatural speed as healing energy poured from him into her damaged flesh. Elder Marcus made a strangled sound behind them, but neither of them paid attention to his shock. The Alpha King's eyes had gone wide with something that looked like recognition and wonder, and when he finally did touch her, placing one warm palm against her shoulder with infinite gentleness, she felt her entire world shift into perfect focus. Mate. The word echoed in her head, and she did not know if it came from her wolf or from the ancient presence that seemed to examine her through his silver eyes. But she felt the truth of it settle into her bones, like something that had been missing her entire life and was now finally found. The golden threads that had always flickered at the edges of her vision blazed into full visibility, connecting her heart to his with light that pulsed in rhythm with their synchronized breathing. He saw them too. She watched his expression shift from wonder to desperate hope to something that looked almost like grief. And when he stepped back from her, breaking the connection that had made her feel whole for the first time in her life, she actually whimpered at the loss. "This is not possible," he breathed, but his words lacked conviction. Behind them, Elder Marcus was making soft sounds of distress, clearly overwhelmed by whatever supernatural forces he was witnessing, but afraid to interrupt. The Alpha King began to pace, his movements sharp with agitation as he processed what had just occurred between them. The mate bond was supposed to be simple, straightforward, a connection between equals that strengthened pack alliances and produced powerful offspring. But this, whatever this was, defied every rule he had ever learned about how such bonds were supposed to work. "You are nobody," he said, and the words hit her like physical blows, even though she could see he was talking to himself rather than delivering a deliberate insult. "You have no bloodline, no pack status, no political value that would justify this connection. The bond should not be possible between us." But even as he spoke the words, she could see him fighting against their logic. His wolf was calling to hers with increasing desperation, and she felt her own respond with a keening cry that spoke of recognition and desperate longing. Whatever his mind believed about the impossibility of their connection, his wolf knew better. "Tell me about the rogue attack," he said suddenly, stopping his pacing to focus on her with renewed intensity. "Tell me exactly what happened when they scented you. Every detail." She recounted the story as clearly as she could, describing the way the rogues had approached pack territory with obvious hostile intent, and how her wolf had refused to let them pass unchallenged. But it was when she reached the part about their sudden stillness that his attention sharpened to laser focus, his silver eyes burning with something that looked like growing understanding. "They stopped fighting the moment they caught your scent," he said slowly. 3 experienced rogues, armed with cursed weapons and clearly prepared for violence, chose to retreat rather than press their advantage against one injured wolf. She nodded, remembering the confusion and fear that had crept into their eyes as they circled her with growing bewilderment. It had made no sense at the time, and it made even less sense now in the safety of hindsight. The Alpha King turned to Elder Marcus with sudden, sharp attention. "Tell me about her parents," he commanded. "Tell me exactly how she came to be part of this pack." Elder Marcus shifted uncomfortably under the weight of that silver stare, his hands fidgeting with the ceremonial medallion that marked his rank within the pack hierarchy. "She was found as an infant on our borders 18 years ago," he said, reciting the story that Lyra had heard countless times throughout her childhood. Abandoned by rogues, or perhaps by a pack that could not afford another mouth to feed. "We took her in out of charity, though she has never shown proper gratitude for our kindness." The Alpha King's expression darkened at the last part of Marcus's recitation, and Lyra felt power ripple outward from him in waves that made the stone walls seem to tremble. "Charity," he repeated, and the word carried enough menace to make Elder Marcus take another step backward. "You call it charity to treat a pack member like a servant, to deny her healing when she is injured defending your territory, to plan her exile after she has proven her loyalty with blood." "Your Majesty," Elder Marcus began, but the Alpha King held up one hand, and the older wolf fell silent immediately. "There is more to this story," the king said, his attention returning to Lyra with an intensity that made her feel like he was reading her soul. "The bond does not lie. It does not choose randomly or make mistakes. If you are my mate, then you are something more than the abandoned foundling they have made you believe yourself to be." The golden threads that connected them pulsed with renewed intensity, and she felt her wolf surge upward in response to his words. Deep in her consciousness, the ancient voice that had whispered to her during fever dreams began to speak more clearly, using words in a language she did not recognize but somehow understood perfectly. "You carry the blood of kings," it said, and the revelation hit her like lightning splitting the sky. "You are the lost daughter of the Silver Wolf line, hidden and protected until the time came for your awakening." She gasped aloud as memories that were not her own flooded through her consciousness, images of wolves with silver-white fur and eyes like starfire, of royal ceremonies and ancient magic that had been dormant in her bloodline for nearly 2 decades. The Alpha King saw the change in her expression and stepped closer, his own wolf responding to the power that was beginning to stir beneath her skin. "What are you remembering?" he asked urgently, and she could hear the desperate hope in his voice. "Silver wolves," she whispered, watching his eyes widen with something that looked like recognition, a bloodline that was supposed to be extinct, ancient magic that was hidden to protect it from those who would use it for dark purposes. "The royal bloodline of the northern kingdoms," he breathed, and she watched wonder and grief war across his features. "The Silver Wolf line that was murdered 18 years ago to prevent a prophecy from coming to pass. 18 years ago. The same time that she had been found as an infant on the pack's borders, abandoned and alone with no explanation for her origins. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in ways that defied everything she had ever believed about herself, and the implications were staggering. If she was truly the lost heir to the Silver Wolf bloodline, then she was not just his mate. She was his equal in every way that mattered, a royal wolf whose birthright had been stolen from her through murder and deception. The bond that had seemed impossible minutes earlier now made perfect sense. The recognition between their wolves explained by bloodlines that had been bound together by prophecy and ancient magic. But it also meant that someone had tried very hard to make sure she never discovered who she truly was. The Alpha King reached for her again, his movements slow and deliberate as he cupped her face in his hands with infinite gentleness. The moment his skin touched hers, the golden light blazed between them with renewed intensity, and she felt her wolf surge upward to meet his with desperate joy. "My queen," he whispered, and the title settled around her shoulders like a crown she had never known she was meant to wear. "My mate, my equal, the other half of my soul that I have been searching for my entire life." And in the growing light of their completed bond, Elder Marcus finally understood what he was witnessing. His face went pale with terror as the full implications of his pack's treatment of their hidden queen became clear, and when he tried to speak, no words would come. The recognition was complete, the bond was sealed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were a blur of impossible intimacy and crushing political reality. The Alpha King had commandeered the pack's guest quarters, transforming the simple stone chambers into a temporary royal residence where he could conduct the business of kingdoms while remaining close enough to monitor her recovery. But it was not duty that drew him to her side every few hours, checking her healing wounds with hands that lingered longer than medical necessity required. It was the mate bond that pulled between them like a golden chain, growing stronger with each passing moment, despite every logical reason why it should not exist. Her wolf had never been so content. For the first time in her life, the restless creature that had paced through her consciousness like a caged thing had settled into perfect stillness, basking in the proximity of its destined mate like a cat stretched out in warm sunlight. When the Alpha King entered her chambers, her wolf would lift its head with quiet satisfaction, and when he left, it would curl up to wait for his return with the patience of something that finally understood its purpose in the world. But the humans were proving more complicated than the wolves. Political necessity demanded that the Alpha King maintain his public facade of formal distance, acknowledging her only as a pack member who had shown unusual loyalty in defending territory. To the watching pack, his frequent visits to check on her recovery could be explained as royal gratitude rather than supernatural compulsion. But Lyra could see the strain in his silver eyes every time he was forced to step back from her, to treat her like a subject rather than the other half of his soul. The arranged engagement to Celeste Blackthorn was still intact. That fact hung between them like a sword poised to fall, turning every moment of connection into bitter-sweet agony. The political alliance between the northern kingdoms and the powerful Blackthorn pack was too important to dissolve without cause that could be explained to the assembled nobility. And what cause could he possibly give that would not sound like madness? That he had discovered his true mate among the servants of a minor border pack. That the abandoned foundling they had all dismissed as worthless carried the blood of the supposedly extinct Silver Wolf line. Even if he could prove her royal heritage, which remained frustratingly elusive despite the growing evidence of her supernatural abilities, the political ramifications would be staggering. Treaties would need to be renegotiated, alliances would shift. The carefully maintained balance of power that had kept the Northern Territories stable for decades would crumble overnight. But the bond did not care about politics. Every time he touched her, ostensibly to check the progress of her healing, golden light would flare between them with increasing intensity. Her wounds were closing with supernatural speed, far beyond what should have been possible even with royal healing abilities, and they both knew it had nothing to do with his power and everything to do with the way their wolves sang to each other across the space that separated them. He brought her food personally, dismissing the servants who should have performed such menial tasks, and she watched him struggle with the intimacy of feeding his mate, while maintaining the pretense that she was merely a pack member under his protection. His fingers would brush hers as he handed her the plate, and she would feel electricity race up her arm straight to her heart, making her wolf whine softly with desperate longing. The conversations were worse than the touches. Late at night, when the rest of the pack had settled into sleep and political necessity no longer demanded witnesses, he would sit beside her narrow bed and they would talk in whispers about everything except the impossible situation that bound them together. He told her about the responsibilities of kingship, the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives, the loneliness of absolute authority that made genuine connection nearly impossible. She told him about the years of invisibility, the desperate need to prove her worth, the way her wolf had always felt like it was waiting for something that never came, until now. But it was during one of these whispered conversations that the crushing reality of their situation finally made itself undeniably clear. "My engagement to Celeste will be announced formally at the midsummer gathering," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he stared at his hands rather than meeting her eyes. "The ceremony itself will take place at the winter solstice, binding our kingdoms together in an alliance that has been negotiated for years." She felt the words hit her like physical blows, each one driving the air from her lungs until she could barely breathe. 3 months. She had 3 months before he would be bound to another woman by laws that superseded even the mate bond. 3 months before political necessity would tear apart the connection that had made her feel whole for the first time in her life. Her wolf keened softly in the depths of her mind, a sound of such profound grief that she had to press her hand to her chest to contain the ache that threatened to split her ribs apart. Across from her, she watched him flinch at the sound, his own wolf responding with a howl of despair that he barely managed to suppress. "The bond will kill us both," she whispered, and they both knew it was true. Mate bonds were not political conveniences that could be negotiated or ignored. They were supernatural forces that bound souls together with chains that could not be broken by human law or royal decree. To deny the bond, to force themselves into relationships with others, would be a slow death that would consume them both from the inside out. "I know," he breathed, and the grief in his voice made her want to reach for him, to offer what comfort she could in the face of an impossible situation. "But I also know what civil war looks like. I know what happens when the balance of power collapses and kingdoms turn on each other like starving wolves. How many people die to satisfy the bond between 2 individuals? The utilitarian logic was unassailable, and she hated him for it, even as she understood the terrible weight of the choice he faced. A king's first duty was to his people, not to his own happiness, and the political consequences of choosing her over Celeste would ripple outward in ways that neither of them could fully predict or control. But late that night, when duty and political necessity had finally released their grip on his conscience, he came to her with desperation in his silver eyes and the mate bond blazing between them like captured starfire. "I cannot stop thinking about you," he confessed, kneeling beside her bed with the humility of a supplicant rather than the authority of a king. "Every moment I spend away from you feels like drowning, and every time I touch you, my wolf demands that I claim you regardless of the consequences." The golden threads that connected them pulsed with renewed intensity, and she felt her own wolf surge upward in response to his proximity. Her healing wounds began to tingle with supernatural energy, but it was not pain that made her gasp. It was the way his presence seemed to complete some fundamental part of her that had been missing her entire life. "Then claim me," she whispered, and watched his eyes go wide with shock and desperate longing. "The laws that govern human politics mean nothing to our wolves. The bond recognizes no authority except itself." His hand moved to cup her face with infinite gentleness, and the moment his skin touched hers, the world exploded into golden light that made the stone walls seem to disappear around them. She felt his wolf calling to hers with ancient words that spoke of recognition and acceptance and eternal devotion, and her own answered with a song of joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes. The mate bond snapped into place like a key turning in a lock. She felt it settle into her bones with the finality of something that had always been meant to happen, connecting her heart to his with chains of light that would never break. His wolf, massive and silver-white and radiating power that made the air itself shimmer, pressed against the edges of her consciousness and was welcomed with desperate relief by her own wolf, which had been waiting its entire life for this moment of completion. But even as the bond sealed itself with supernatural fire, she could see the conflict tearing him apart. His wolf had claimed its mate with fierce possessive joy, but his human mind was already calculating the political cost of what they had just done. The bond would make it impossible for him to consummate a relationship with anyone else, would make his engagement to Celeste a torture that neither of them deserved. "We cannot undo this," he said, and there was wonder and grief warring in his voice. "I would not want to," she replied, and felt the truth of it settle into her heart with perfect certainty. Whatever the cost, whatever the political consequences, she would choose this connection over everything else the world had to offer. His arms came around her with desperate tenderness, pulling her against his chest so she could feel the rapid beating of his heart and the way his wolf purred with satisfaction at having its mate finally close enough to protect. The bond pulsed between them like a second heartbeat, and she felt her own healing accelerate under the influence of his proximity until her wounds were nothing but faint silver scars that would serve as reminders of the night her real life had finally begun. But outside the golden bubble of their connection, the world continued to turn with relentless indifference to supernatural bonds and destined love. Political obligations waited with patient cruelty, and somewhere in the distance she could already hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats that would bring new complications to their impossible situation. The Alpha King's arranged bride was coming to claim what she believed was rightfully hers, and the mate bond that blazed between them would soon be tested by forces that cared nothing for destiny and everything for power. Her wolf settled against his with quiet contentment, finally at peace after a lifetime of restless waiting. But even in her supernatural euphoria, Lyra knew that the real battle was only just beginning. Celeste Blackthorn arrived like a storm given human form. Lyra felt her presence before the official announcement reached the pack, a disturbance in the natural order that made her wolf pace with sudden agitation, and the mate bond pulse with warning signals that crawled along her skin like electricity. She was in the kitchens helping Martha prepare the evening meal when the golden threads connecting her to the Alpha King suddenly blazed with tension, and she knew without being told that their fragile sanctuary of stolen moments and whispered confessions had come to an end. The entire pack assembled in the courtyard to witness the arrival of their future queen, and Lyra found herself pressed into service, carrying trays of ceremonial wine that would toast the political alliance about to destroy her world. She kept her head down and her movements careful, every instinct screaming at her to remain invisible as Celeste's entourage swept through the gates with the pomp and circumstance that befitted one of the most powerful bloodlines in the Northern Territories. Celeste herself was everything that Lyra was not. Beautiful in the classical sense, with golden hair that caught the afternoon sunlight and skin that had never known the roughness of manual labour or the sting of public humiliation. Her wolf was visible just beneath the surface of her human form, a creature of amber and bronze that radiated confidence and unquestioned authority. She moved through the assembled pack like she already owned them, her smile perfectly calculated to project warmth while her eyes assessed everything with the cold precision of someone who saw people as political assets to be managed. But it was the way the Alpha King greeted her that made Lyra's heart crack like glass in her chest. He stepped forward with fluid grace, every inch the royal figure that political necessity demanded him to be. And when he took Celeste's hand in his and raised it to his lips in formal greeting, the gesture looked so natural that for a moment Lyra could almost believe that she had imagined everything that had passed between them. The mate bond, the golden light, the way his wolf had claimed hers with desperate possessive joy. All of it felt suddenly fragile and insubstantial in the face of this display of practiced courtship. "My lord," Celeste said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had been raised to be a queen, and even from across the courtyard, Lyra could hear the subtle possessiveness in those two simple words. "It has been far too long since we last met. I trust you found your business here satisfactory." Her gaze swept across the assembled pack as she spoke, cataloguing faces and filing away information with the efficiency of someone who understood that knowledge was power. When those calculating eyes fell on Lyra, standing half hidden behind a tray of wine cups in her servant's clothing, there was a moment of assessment that felt like being examined by a predator deciding whether something was worth killing. Then the moment passed, and Celeste was smiling again, her attention returning to the Alpha King with renewed focus as she began the delicate dance of political flirtation that would reinforce their public connection. She touched his arm when she laughed at his responses, stood just close enough to suggest intimacy without impropriety, and made sure that everyone watching could see how perfectly suited they were to rule together. Lyra watched it all with the detached fascination of someone witnessing her own execution. The Alpha King played his part flawlessly, responding to Celeste's advances with exactly the right degree of interest and respect. But Lyra could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, could feel through the mate bond the way his wolf raged against the performance, even as his human mind acknowledged its political necessity. Every smile he gave Celeste sent spikes of pain through the golden connection, and every time their hands brushed in seemingly casual contact, Lyra felt like she was drowning in the wrongness of it all. The formal dinner that evening was a masterpiece of barely concealed torture. Lyra had been assigned to serve the high table, a duty that forced her to witness every moment of Celeste's campaign to solidify her claim on the Alpha King's attention. She moved between the chairs like a ghost, refilling wine cups and removing empty plates, while listening to conversations that carved pieces from her heart with surgical precision. Celeste spoke of their future with the confidence of someone whose plans were already set in stone. The winter wedding, the political advantages their union would bring to both kingdoms, the strong children they would produce to carry on their combined bloodlines. She painted a picture of domestic harmony and political stability that made perfect sense to everyone listening, and Lyra watched the Alpha King nod in all the right places while the mate bond between them screamed with increasing desperation. But it was during the toasts to their engagement that Celeste revealed the steel beneath her beautiful facade. She had manoeuvred the conversation toward pack security and border defence, praising the Alpha King's thorough investigation of the recent rogue incursions while subtly questioning the competence of pack leadership that had allowed such breaches to occur in the first place. Her words were perfectly diplomatic, couched in language that suggested concern rather than criticism, but Lyra could see Elder Marcus and the other pack leaders growing increasingly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "I understand there was some excitement during your visit," Celeste said, her voice carrying just enough curiosity to make the question seem casual. "A servant girl who took it upon herself to hunt rogues without authorization? How fortunate that your arrival prevented what could have been a serious diplomatic incident." The Alpha King's hand tightened around his wine cup with enough force that Lyra was surprised the metal did not bend, but his voice remained perfectly controlled when he responded. The individual in question showed remarkable courage in defending pack territory against armed intruders, he said carefully. Her actions prevented the rogues from reaching the inner settlements where pack children were sleeping. Celeste's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in her eyes at his defence of Lyra's actions. "Of course," she murmured, and there was silk wrapped around steel in her tone. "Though I hope such reckless behaviour will not be encouraged going forward. A pack's strength lies in discipline and proper hierarchy, not in individuals who believe themselves above established authority." The warning was delivered so smoothly that most of the listening pack members probably missed its significance, but Lyra felt it settle into her bones like a death sentence. Celeste had identified her as a threat to be eliminated, and the casual efficiency with which she had delivered that assessment spoke of someone who was accustomed to removing obstacles from her path. After the dinner, as Lyra cleared the remnants of the meal that had celebrated her own doom, she found herself alone in the kitchen with thoughts that felt too dangerous to pursue. The mate bond pulled at her constantly now, a golden chain that connected her to someone who was being systematically claimed by another woman, and the physical pain of it was beginning to make her wonder if a clean death might be preferable to this slow torture. But then he appeared in the kitchen doorway like a figure conjured from her desperate longing, his silver eyes wild with something that looked dangerously close to panic. "We need to talk," he said, and his voice carried an urgency that made her wolf lift its head with sudden attention. Now, away from watching eyes and political necessity. She followed him through corridors that seemed to blur with supernatural speed, her awareness narrowed to the bond that blazed between them and the desperate need to understand what had driven him to seek her out, despite the risks. He led her to a small chamber that had once been used for storing ceremonial items, a space so removed from the main pack areas that they could speak without fear of being overheard. The moment the door closed behind them, he was across the room and pulling her into his arms with desperate intensity, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted of wine and desperation and the bitter salt of tears she had not realized she was crying. The mate bond exploded into golden fire around them, washing away the pain of watching him with another woman and replacing it with the fierce certainty that this connection was real, was permanent, was the only thing that mattered in a world gone mad with political necessity. "She is going to try to kill you," he breathed against her lips when they finally broke apart, and the words hit her like ice water, despite the heat still blazing between them. "I saw it in her eyes during dinner, the way she assessed you and filed you away as a problem to be solved. She knows what you are to me, even if she cannot understand how or why." Lyra felt her wolf snarl with defiant fury at the threat, but beneath the supernatural bravado she was terrified in a way that had nothing to do with personal safety and everything to do with the possibility of being separated from him permanently. If Celeste succeeded in eliminating her, the mate bond would drive him slowly insane, turning their destined love into a source of unbearable torment. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, and felt him tighten his arms around her like he could somehow protect her from the political forces that were already moving to tear them apart. "I do not know," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice was more frightening than any lie could have been. "But I know that I cannot watch you die to satisfy political convenience, and I cannot live without the other half of my soul, regardless of what it costs my kingdom." The golden threads that connected them pulsed with renewed strength, fed by his declaration and her own fierce determination to fight for what they had found together. But even as they held each other in the darkness of the storage room, both of them could hear the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, searching footsteps that suggested their absence had been noticed. Political necessity was coming to reclaim him, and with it the subtle but deadly campaign that would determine whether their impossible love could survive the machinations of someone who had never learned to accept defeat. The real battle was about to begin. Death came disguised as kindness. Lyra should have known that the perfectly prepared breakfast tray was too generous, too carefully arranged, too thoughtful to be anything other than a trap. But 3 days of watching Celeste charm the Alpha King with practiced perfection had worn her defences thin, and the small kindness of honey cakes and fresh fruit felt like a lifeline thrown to someone who was already drowning in political despair. She was halfway through the meal when her wolf began to pace with sudden violent agitation. The sensation started as a tingling in her fingertips, barely noticeable beneath the constant ache of the mate bond that pulled toward the Alpha King's distant presence in the pack leader's chambers. But within moments the tingling had become burning, and the burning had become agony that raced through her bloodstream like liquid fire. Her vision blurred, and she felt her knees give out as poison flooded her system with supernatural efficiency. Wolfsbane, but not the common variety that most packs use to subdue dangerous criminals or treat infected wounds. This was something darker, more concentrated, designed not just to incapacitate, but to kill slowly and with maximum suffering. Someone had wanted her death to look like an accident, a tragic case of mistaken dosage rather than deliberate murder. Her wolf fought the poison with desperate fury, but even supernatural healing had its limits when faced with toxins specifically designed to target their kind. She felt her consciousness fragmenting as the wolfsbane attacked her nervous system, sending her human mind spinning away into darkness, while her wolf clawed frantically at the barriers that kept it trapped beneath her skin. But as death crept closer with relentless patience, something extraordinary happened. Power that had been dormant for 18 years suddenly blazed to life in her chest, silver light pouring from her skin with enough intensity to make the stone walls seem transparent. Her wolf, instead of weakening under the poison's assault, began to grow larger and more defined, as if the threat to her life had finally triggered the awakening that had been waiting her entire existence to manifest. The wolfsbane that should have killed her within minutes began to burn away like mist before sunlight, consumed by healing energy that belonged to bloodlines older than the kingdoms themselves. She felt her spine straighten as ancient power flowed through her bones, and when she looked down at her hands, she saw silver light dancing beneath her skin like captured starfire. Royal magic. The birthright that had been suppressed and hidden since infancy was finally breaking free, and the timing could not have been coincidental. Someone had tried to poison her because they feared what she might become, but their attempt at murder had accomplished exactly the opposite. It had awakened the sleeping queen. The mate bond exploded into golden fire as the Alpha King felt her distress from across the compound, and she heard his roar of rage echo through the stone corridors as he abandoned whatever political meeting he had been enduring to reach her side. But by the time he arrived, finding her collapsed on the floor of her quarters, with silver light still crackling around her like armour, the immediate crisis had passed. "What happened?" he demanded, dropping to his knees beside her with desperate hands that searched for injuries while his wolf paced frantically just beneath his skin. The bond told him she had been in mortal danger, but the evidence before him suggested something far more complex than a simple attack. "Wolfsbane," she managed to whisper, though her voice came out stronger than it should have after such an ordeal. "In the breakfast, someone wanted me dead, but the poison triggered something instead of killing me." She held up her hands, and they both watched silver light dance across her palms like living things. The power felt natural now, like something that had always been part of her, but had been locked away behind barriers that were only now crumbling. Her wolf had grown quiet and confident, no longer the restless, uncertain creature that had paced through her consciousness for years. Now it moved with the fluid grace of something that finally understood its own strength. The Alpha King's expression shifted from concern to wonder to something that looked dangerously close to awe as he processed what he was witnessing. "Your royal bloodline," he breathed, reaching out to touch the silver light that danced around her skin. "It has fully awakened. Whoever tried to kill you has given you the greatest gift possible. They have restored you to what you were always meant to be." But the implications were staggering, and they both knew it. If her royal abilities were active, if the Silver Wolf bloodline had truly awakened after 18 years of dormancy, then the political landscape was about to shift in ways that no one had anticipated. She was no longer just his mate, hidden and powerless. She was a rival claimant to authority that superseded every treaty and alliance that had been negotiated in her absence. Footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of others drawn by the commotion, and the Alpha King moved to shield her from view as Elder Marcus burst through the door with several pack hunters close behind. Their expressions shifted from concern to shock as they took in the scene, the silver light that still flickered around her skin, making it impossible to pretend that something ordinary had just occurred. "What sorcery is this?" Elder Marcus demanded, but his voice carried more fear than outrage. Behind him, the other pack members were backing toward the door as if her newly awakened power was something that might be contagious. "Not sorcery," the Alpha King said, rising to his feet with the fluid authority that came naturally to those born to rule. "Birthright, the silver wolf bloodline that your pack has spent 18 years trying to suppress and deny. Someone just made the mistake of trying to murder a queen, and she has responded accordingly." But even as he spoke the words that would change everything, Lyra could see the conflict tearing him apart. Her awakening solved one problem while creating a dozen others, and the political ramifications were already cascading outward in ways that would be impossible to control. If she truly carried the blood of the extinct royal line, if her power was real and not some supernatural anomaly, then every alliance and treaty in the Northern Territories would need to be renegotiated, including his engagement to Celeste. The thought had occurred to both of them simultaneously, and she watched his expression shift as he calculated the possibilities and costs of acknowledging what she had become. A living heir to the Silver Wolf throne changed everything about the political equation, but it also painted a target on her back that would never disappear. There would always be someone who benefited from her death, someone who preferred the current balance of power to the chaos that her existence represented. Martha appeared in the doorway behind the pack hunters, her weathered face pale with something that looked like recognition and old grief. She pushed through the crowd with determined efficiency, her eyes fixed on the silver light that still danced around Lyra's skin with lazy contentment. "I knew this day would come," she said quietly, and her words carried a weight that made everyone in the room turn to look at her with sudden attention. "I have been waiting 18 years for the royal bloodline to awaken, for the lost daughter to reclaim her birthright and set the world to rights again." Elder Marcus made a sound of protest, but Martha ignored him completely, her attention focused on Lyra with an intensity that spoke of secrets finally being revealed. "Your parents were murdered to prevent this awakening," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Their deaths were not random violence, but a calculated attempt to end the Silver Wolf line before the prophecy could be fulfilled. But you survived, hidden among us and protected by those who remembered what the old blood meant to our people. The prophecy." Lyra felt the words settle into her consciousness, like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for decades. Ancient magic, royal bloodlines, mate bonds that defied political logic. All of it was connected by threads of destiny that had been woven before her birth, and the wolfsbane that should have killed her had instead triggered the awakening that would fulfill whatever cosmic plan had been set in motion 18 years ago. But prophecies, she was beginning to understand, were dangerous things that attracted dangerous people. The Alpha King moved closer to her, his protective instincts overriding political caution as he processed the implications of Martha's revelation. If there was a conspiracy to eliminate the Silver Wolf bloodline, if her parents' deaths had been orchestrated rather than accidental, then the attempt on her life was just the beginning. Someone out there knew exactly what she was and had been waiting for her power to manifest so they could eliminate the threat permanently. "Who?" he demanded, turning to Martha with silver eyes that promised retribution for anyone who had dared to threaten his mate. "Who orchestrated the murders 18 years ago and who tried to poison her today?" But before Martha could answer, before the truth could finally be spoken aloud, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade dipped in honey. "What fascinating questions," Celeste said from the doorway, her golden beauty unmarked by any sign of concern despite the chaos that had erupted in her absence. "I do hope we find satisfying answers to them all." And in the way she smiled as she surveyed the scene, in the calculating assessment that flickered behind her amber eyes as she took in Lyra's newly awakened power, everyone in the room finally understood who had been playing the longest game of all. The real enemy had just revealed herself, and the battle for the throne was about to begin. The silence that followed Celeste's arrival stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Lyra felt her newly awakened power surge in response to the threat, silver light crackling around her skin with increasing intensity as her wolf recognized the predator that had been circling them with patient calculation. The royal magic that had been dormant for 18 years now blazed through her veins like liquid starfire, and for the first time in her life she felt truly dangerous. Celeste's amber eyes fixed on the silver light with fascination rather than fear, and her smile carried the satisfied edge of someone whose long-term planning had finally reached its intended conclusion. She stepped into the room with fluid grace, seemingly oblivious to the tension that had every other person pressed against the walls in instinctive retreat from whatever supernatural forces were building between the two women. "How remarkable," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones that had charmed courts and kingdoms for years. The lost royal bloodline manifesting at such a convenient moment. One might almost suspect that recent events were orchestrated to achieve exactly this result. The Alpha King moved to place himself between Lyra and Celeste with protective instincts that overrode political caution, but his intended bride simply laughed at the gesture. Her amusement was genuine and warm, like she was watching a particularly entertaining performance rather than witnessing the collapse of her carefully constructed plans. "Oh, my dear king," she murmured, stepping around him with the confidence of someone who had never learned to fear opposition. "You still do not understand what is really happening here, do you? You think this is about mate bonds and romantic destiny, but the truth is so much more interesting than supernatural love stories." Silver light flared around Lyra as ancient magic responded to the threat in Celeste's words, and she felt her wolf surge upward with regal authority that demanded recognition from everyone in the room. But instead of cowering before the display of royal power, Celeste clapped her hands together in apparent delight. "There she is," she breathed, and there was genuine appreciation in her voice. The Silver Queen that the prophecies promised would rise to claim her throne. 18 years I have been waiting for this moment. 18 years of careful planning and patient positioning to ensure that when the lost heir finally awakened, I would be perfectly placed to benefit from the chaos that followed. The admission hit the room like lightning, and Lyra watched Elder Marcus and the other pack members exchange glances of growing horror as they began to understand the scope of Celeste's manipulation. The political alliance, the arranged engagement, even her presence at the pack compound during Lyra's awakening. All of it had been calculated moves in a game that stretched back nearly 2 decades. "You orchestrated everything," the Alpha King said, and his voice carried the deadly quiet that preceded violence. "The rogue attacks, the assassination attempt, even our engagement. All of it was designed to force her awakening so you could eliminate the threat to your own ambitions." Celeste's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in her amber eyes as she assessed the growing hostility in the room. "Orchestrated is such a harsh word," she said with mock offence. "I prefer to think of it as careful cultivation of opportunity. The rogue attacks were simply a matter of redirecting existing threats toward useful targets. The wolfsbane was regrettably necessary to trigger the awakening that prophecy demanded. And as for our engagement, well, what better way to ensure I was present for the climactic moment than to position myself as your devoted bride-to-be?" The casual admission of attempted murder sent fury blazing through the mate bond, and Lyra felt the Alpha King's wolf surge forward with killing intent that made the air itself seem to vibrate with barely contained violence. But before he could act on the protective rage that demanded Celeste's immediate destruction, she held up one perfectly manicured hand in a gesture that somehow managed to be both elegant and threatening. Now, she chided gently. "Violence would be terribly premature at this stage, especially when you do not yet understand what I am actually offering." Silver light pulsed around Lyra as her power responded to the emotional chaos in the room, and she felt ancient magic stirring in her chest like something that had been sleeping for centuries and was finally ready to wake. The royal bloodline that Celeste had tried to eliminate was manifesting with increasing strength, but instead of fear, she felt only grim satisfaction at the thought of what was about to unfold. "What are you offering?" she asked, and her voice carried an authority that made everyone in the room turn to look at her with sudden attention. Her wolf had grown quiet and confident, no longer the restless creature that had paced through her consciousness for years, but something that moved with the fluid grace of absolute certainty. Celeste's expression shifted to something that looked almost like respect as she took in Lyra's transformed presence, the way silver light danced around her skin like living armour, and royal power blazed in her eyes with unmistakable intensity. When she spoke, her words were directed at Lyra rather than the Alpha King, acknowledging the shift in authority that everyone could feel, but no one had yet dared to name. "Partnership," she said simply. "You have royal blood and ancient magic, but you lack political connections and military resources. I have spent years building alliances and accumulating power, but I am not the prophesied heir that the old families will follow into battle. Together, we could reshape the Northern Territories according to our own vision, rather than submitting to the chaos that your awakening will inevitably unleash." The proposal was breathtaking in its audacity, and Lyra felt her newly awakened power respond to the possibility with something that felt dangerously close to temptation. Royal magic and political cunning combined could accomplish things that neither could achieve alone, and the part of her that had spent 18 years being dismissed and underestimated was drawn to the idea of seizing control rather than waiting for others to determine her fate. But the mate bond that connected her to the Alpha King pulsed with warning, and her wolf lifted its head with quiet disdain for the offer that would require her to abandon everything that truly mattered. "You tried to murder me," Lyra said, and silver light flared around her with renewed intensity. "You arranged for rogues to attack pack territory, knowing that I would feel compelled to defend it. You poisoned my food with wolfsbane specifically designed to cause maximum suffering, and now you want to propose partnership as if attempted murder is simply another negotiating tactic." Celeste shrugged with elegant indifference, apparently unbothered by the accusation or the supernatural power that was building to dangerous levels around her intended victim. "Political necessity often requires unpleasant actions," she said with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "I needed to trigger your awakening, and mortal danger was the most efficient method available. The fact that you survived and manifested your full power proves that my assessment was correct. You are strong enough to be a worthy partner, rather than another obstacle to be eliminated." The Alpha King moved forward with fluid menace, his own power beginning to manifest as silver-white light that made the stone walls seem to tremble in response. But it was Lyra who spoke, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally understood exactly what she was and what that meant for everyone who had underestimated her. "I have a counter-proposal," she said, and watched Celeste's expression shift from confident superiority to something that looked almost like wariness. "You will leave this pack compound immediately. You will dissolve the engagement that was based on lies and manipulation, and you will never again threaten anyone under my protection, or I will demonstrate exactly what the awakened Silver Wolf bloodline is capable of accomplishing." Silver light blazed around her with enough intensity to make everyone in the room shield their eyes, and she felt her wolf surge forward with regal authority that demanded submission from everything it encountered. The royal magic that had been suppressed for 18 years now flowed through her veins like liquid fire, and she finally understood why so many people had worked so hard to prevent this moment from arriving. She was not just the Alpha King's mate, hidden and powerless. She was the prophesied heir to a throne that superseded every political alliance in the Northern Territories, and her awakening changed everything about the balance of power that had kept the kingdom stable for decades. Celeste's composure cracked for the first time since her arrival, and genuine surprise flickered across her features as she reassessed the situation with the efficiency of someone who had not anticipated this level of resistance. Behind her, Lyra could see her own guards shifting nervously as they felt the weight of royal authority pressing down on them like a physical thing. "You think your bloodline gives you the right to make demands," Celeste said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "You have power, I will grant you that. But power without allies is just a pretty light show that will be snuffed out the moment you face organised opposition." "Then let us see which of us has chosen better allies," Lyra replied, and felt the mate bond flare with golden fire as the Alpha King stepped up beside her with silver eyes blazing with protective fury and absolute support. The battle lines had been drawn, and the Silver Queen had finally claimed her throne. The challenge came with the rising sun. Lyra woke to find Celeste's formal declaration of trial by combat waiting outside her door, written on parchment that carried the official seals of 3 neighbouring packs and the ancient authority of laws that predated kingdoms. The elegant script detailed accusations of false bloodline claims, supernatural deception, and unlawful interference in established political alliances. But beneath the formal language, the message was brutally simple: prove your royal heritage through combat, or die as the pretender you claim not to be. The Alpha King found her in the courtyard an hour later, standing perfectly still in the centre of the space where pack members had gathered for morning training. Silver light danced around her skin in lazy spirals, no longer the wild, uncontrolled power that had blazed during her awakening, but something focused and deliberate that responded to her will with increasing precision. She accepted, he said, and it was not a question. His silver eyes were dark with something that looked like grief and rage warring for dominance, and she could feel through the mate bond the way his wolf paced with desperate protective fury at the thought of watching her face mortal danger. "The ancient laws gave me no choice," she replied, testing the way her newly awakened power flowed through her limbs like liquid fire. "If I had refused, it would have been taken as proof that my claims were false, that the royal bloodline manifestation was some kind of elaborate deception. And Celeste knew that when she issued the challenge, 3 opponents. That was the traditional format for trials of royal succession. 3 champions representing different aspects of leadership that a true heir would need to master in order to claim the throne. Combat prowess, strategic thinking, and the supernatural authority to command the loyalty of other wolves. Each opponent would test her abilities in a different way, and failure in any category would result in death. But it was not the physical danger that made her wolf pace with restless energy. It was the knowledge that Celeste had chosen her champions with the same careful calculation that had guided every other aspect of her 18-year plan. The first champion was Marcus Ironwood, Celeste's personal bodyguard, and a warrior whose reputation for brutality had earned him fear and respect across multiple kingdoms. 7 feet tall and built like a siege engine, with scars that spoke of battles won through overwhelming force rather than tactical finesse. His wolf was a massive black creature that radiated menace even in human form, and when he looked at Lyra, she saw only cold assessment of her weaknesses. The second champion was Elena Swiftrunner, a strategy master who had earned her position through political manoeuvring that made Celeste's manipulations look simple by comparison, smaller and faster than Marcus, but with eyes that missed nothing and a mind that calculated advantage with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. Her wolf was grey-brown and lean, built for endurance and intelligence rather than raw power. But it was the third champion that made Lyra's blood run cold with recognition. Elder Marcus stepped forward to join Celeste's chosen fighters, his expression carrying the vindictive satisfaction of someone who had finally found a legal method to eliminate the problem that had plagued him for 18 years. His wolf might not be the largest or the fastest, but he knew her fighting style better than anyone, had watched her train and struggle and fail for years before her awakening changed everything. He would know exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage, and he would take pleasure in every wound he inflicted. The combat arena had been prepared according to ancient ritual, blessed ground where supernatural abilities would be amplified, and the barriers between human and wolf form would be thin enough to allow rapid shifting. Runes carved into the stone perimeter glowed with silver light that matched the power flowing through her veins, and she felt her wolf respond to the sacred space with something that looked almost like hunger. This was where she would prove herself, or die in the attempt. There would be no second chances, no political manoeuvring that could save her if her newly awakened abilities proved insufficient against opponents who had been chosen specifically for their capacity to exploit her weaknesses. The Alpha King stood at the edge of the arena with silver eyes that burned with barely contained fury, his own wolf pacing just beneath his skin with desperate need to enter the battle and protect his mate from threats that supernatural law prevented him from engaging. But the ancient laws were absolute. Royal succession could only be proven through single combat, and any interference would void her claim permanently. Around them, the entire pack had assembled to witness what would either be her coronation or her execution. She could feel their attention like weight pressing down on her shoulders, some hoping for her victory, others waiting eagerly for her failure and the return to familiar hierarchies that her existence had disrupted. But as Celeste stepped forward to officially begin the trial, something unexpected happened. Martha appeared at the edge of the arena, carrying a bundle wrapped in silver cloth, her weathered face set with determination that brooked no argument from the pack elders who tried to intercept her. She pushed through the crowd with surprising strength, her eyes fixed on Lyra with an intensity that spoke of secrets finally ready to be revealed. Before she faces trial, Martha announced in a voice that carried clearly across the assembled crowd, she must be given what belongs to her by right of birth and bloodline. The bundle she carried pulsed with ancient magic that made the runes around the arena flare brighter, and when she unwrapped it, gasps of recognition rippled through the watching pack members. A sword, silver bright and humming with power that resonated with the royal magic flowing through Lyra's veins. The blade that had belonged to the last Silver Queen, hidden away for 18 years and waiting for the prophesied heir to claim it. The moment Lyra's fingers closed around the hilt, the world exploded into silver fire. Power that had been building steadily since her awakening suddenly reached critical mass, transforming her from a newly manifested royal into something that blazed with the accumulated authority of every Silver Queen who had come before her. The sword sang in her hands, its ancient magic merging with her bloodline abilities to create something that was more than the sum of its parts. Her wolf, which had been growing stronger and more confident with each passing day, suddenly stood fully revealed in all its supernatural glory. Silver-white fur that seemed to capture and reflect moonlight, eyes that burned with starfire, and a presence that demanded submission from everything it encountered. This was not just the lost royal heir learning to use her power. This was the Silver Queen reclaiming her throne. The three champions who had seemed so formidable moments earlier now looked at her with expressions that ranged from uncertainty to outright fear. Marcus Ironwood's confidence wavered as he felt the weight of true royal authority pressing down on his consciousness, and Elena Swiftrunner's strategic calculations suddenly had to account for variables that defied every assumption she had made about her opponent's capabilities. But it was Elder Marcus whose reaction was the most telling. The man who had spent 18 years dismissing and degrading her now stared at the transformed figure she had become with growing horror, finally understanding that he had not been persecuting a worthless servant, but tormenting a queen who would soon have the power to demand justice for every cruelty he had inflicted. "Let the trial begin," Lyra said, and her voice carried the authority of ancient magic and royal bloodline, combined into something that made the very air shimmer with power. The first champion charged with berserker fury, But she was no longer the uncertain girl who had stumbled through pack training sessions while enduring mockery and abuse. She was the Silver Queen, wielding a blade that had tasted the blood of her enemies for centuries, and when she moved to meet Marcus Ironwood's attack, it was with supernatural grace that made combat look like a deadly dance. Silver light blazed around them as steel met steel, and the real battle for the throne finally began.